Good morning. Hope everybody's doing well this 4th of July weekend. We are in week 7 of 8 of our Moses series, and so as we're drawing this to a close, I think it's been a fantastic series. We've learned a lot. We are going to move, and these last 2 messages are going to be more around the time of Moses, if you will. So we're actually not going to be in Exodus today. We're going to be in Numbers 13. If you want to go ahead and flip to that, we'll start in verse 25 when we get there in just a minute. And, as I was thinking through this message and just, you'll see sort of the connection as we get there, I thought back to just my freshman year at college, and I wanted to share a little bit with some of you guys who may not know about me as much and some of the things that I really enjoy. I really like outdoors, camping, backpacking, hiking, that kind of thing. And so the summer after my freshman year, I got this opportunity to work with a group called Christian High Adventure, or CHA for short. Has anybody ever heard of Christian High Adventure? All right, I got one person. That's more than... Stephen, you don't count. You heard it in first service. But Christian High Adventure is a organization, and from North Carolina, they actually operate out of Camp Caraway. So some of you may be more familiar with that over in Asheboro. But what they do is they take 2 guys in college, and you are basically paid to then, and they provide all your supplies and everything, and you lead week-long backpacking trips with youth groups and stuff on the Appalachian Trail in Virginia. I mean, it's like a jackpot job for me. It was awesome. I had a blast. I got to spend all summer doing that, and plus it really helped me ministry-wise because that was the first time I had really been put in a position where I was expected to create and lead a regular devotion and really get to know students and try to help them grow and answer their questions. Because we spent 24 hours a day for a week together in tents and that kind of thing. So it was really just an awesome experience. However, we had to have, obviously, a training week, right? And they didn't just send us out there with a bunch of teenagers and say, good luck. So we went up to this area. It's near Damascus, Virginia, if you're familiar with that, over spring break. Now, spring break in March, it's cold up there, so it was miserable. But we had people with us, training us all week, and they left out Wednesday evening, left us there. Me and Michael, who was the guy I worked with all summer, and then we had one alternate in case one of us got hurt that could then take our place. And so what we had to do the next morning was we had to hike around the entire area that we were going to be working in for the entire week in case we had a group get lost, so we would be able to find them. So that morning we got up. I think it was 15, 16 miles, something like that, we hiked that day. That's a long way in the mountains. It was a lot. And we got back that evening, the sun was going down, and we were exhausted to the point that we were debating if we were going to cook dinner. Now listen, if you can exhaust a 19-year-old guy to the point where he's not sure he wants to eat, you have accomplished something. But what I can remember as we're having this conversation in the back of my mind is, how in the world could I do this for 40 years? Like, I just remember that sticking in the back of my head. How can I just wander through an area that with nothing, there's nothing there, day in and day out for 40 years? I just couldn't fathom that level of exhaustion over and over and over. And so that's actually the story we're going to talk about this morning. We're going to talk about how did Israel go from the edge of the promised land to spending 40 years wandering in the desert. Now, if you don't know, it's actually almost impressive that they were able to stay lost for 40 years because it's estimated, based on the area they were in, it should have taken 11 days to walk in completely across the region they were lost in. To turn an 11-day walk into a 40-year marathon, it's almost impressive. And so it just speaks again to the fact that this was clearly a work of God, that they were lost in this area. And so again, how do we apply that to our own lives? Because I think it really is an excellent case study for ourselves, for our churches, for our families sometimes even, because I don't know for us today that the promised land, that the significance of that was its location and its resources and everything that it had. I think what's important for us today, and even what the Israelites missed in that time frame, is that it was God's will for His people to be there. And so for us, I think that we all have to acknowledge and realize that we all have a promised land, so to speak. We all have an area in our lives. We all have things that God desires in our lives. God has a will for each one of us. And so each day we find ourselves standing at the edge of that, where we have to make important, pivotal decisions about whether we're going forward into that promised land or whether we're going to make a right turn and go off into a desert-like wasteland. And so this was really sort of a timely message in my own life. And even I think for our churches in general, Big C Church, where we find ourselves. Because I see us wandering around a lot of times in our own lives, a lot more in confusion and just sort of drifting aimlessly, as opposed to taking a hold of God's will in our own lives and pursuing that passionately. I see us a lot more accepting sort of things as is rather than going after God's promises. And so what I want to do, I want to hit three things I think that really caused the Israelites to make a decision to go back into the wilderness and wander around as opposed to pursuing God's will and God's desire for them as a people. And in those three things, I think there's some lessons we can learn and apply to our own lives that can hopefully prevent us from making that same decision. So again, Numbers 13, we're going to start in verse 25. And we're going to read all the way to chapter 14, verse 4, and it will show up on the screen here behind me if you don't have your Bible with you. And so it says, at the end of 40 days, they returned from spying out the land. So let me give you some context really quickly. Israelites have arrived at the edge of the promised land, and Moses has selected one man from each tribe, 12 tribes of Israel. And he says, okay, I want you to go in. I want you to scout this area. Take inventory. Tell us what's there. Tell us who's there. Tell us what we're facing. And so that's the journey they've done. So as the Israelite people, here we are sitting on the edge of God's promises, waiting for about a month and change for these guys to come back. And so they've returned, and that's where we see ourselves. So they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruits of the land. And they told him, we came to the land which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there, and the Amalekites dwell in the land of Negeb. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the hill country, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea, along the Jordan. But then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it. Then the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we had gone to spy out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so seemed to them. Then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, would that we have died in the land of Egypt, or had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to one another, let's choose a leader and head back to Egypt. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with this term, but I have an astigmatism in my right eye. Who knows what an astigmatism is? All right, good. A little more familiarity there. For those of you who don't know, it means basically you have a hard time focusing, especially as things change distance. Now, this is a challenge for me because one of my hobbies, I like to, a little bit of a gun nut. I like to collect and shoot guns. Well, I have to shoot, for lack of a better term, cross-eyed, because I cannot focus with this eye. But I'm trying to learn to shoot with both eyes. This is with a pistol. And what I quickly picked up is that depending upon what I am looking at, whether it's the target, the front sight, or the rear sights, everything else gets blurry. It goes out of focus. And I think that's what the Israelites have done here. They stopped looking at the target, and they began to see the things around them. And so certain things began to come into focus and began to force God's promises out of focus. And I think that some of those things may be doing that in our own lives, we may be beginning to look at and focus on things around us as opposed to God's will. And it may be forcing God's will out of focus in our own lives. And so the first thing I see, and this is your first point this morning on your notes, that the Israelites began to focus on was they began to focus on the fear. And we read through this passage, just put yourself in their shoes for a second, right? You've been waiting for a long time. And these guys come back and they've got all this great report of how awesome the land was. They even brought back some things to demonstrate how good it is. And you're sitting there and you're thinking, man, we spent hundreds of years in slavery. We struggled running from an army going across a very difficult desert. And you're starting to think, well, maybe, just maybe, things are going to start to go right. Right? You begin to let yourself believe that. And then you hear the word you don't want to hear. But. See, I imagine you could hear a pin drop at that point. Right? And then they begin to describe how difficult things were and how impossible things are going to be. And I'm sure you would automatically default to this idea in your own mind that if it's too good to be true, then it probably is. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And so as this report continues to roll in about these enemies and how big they are and how fierce they are in the walled cities, and you're sort of beginning to look around. And if you think tactically or logically at all, you're thinking, we're just a bunch of spies. I don't even know that we have a bunch of slaves. I don't even know that we have any weapons. A lot of us are just women and children. This is, from all perspectives, a tactical nightmare, save for one perspective. And that's sort of the perspective you see as these 10 spies are saying, this is basically a suicide mission. Caleb speaks up. And he begins to say, hey, wait a minute. We're forgetting a couple things here. We're beginning to let fear and what we're afraid of begin to direct our course. And notice what he says. He doesn't contradict anything about the size of the city or the size of the people or how hard it will be. All he simply says is, let's go right now because we are able to overcome it. See, I think the difference is Caleb wasn't focusing on the things to be afraid of. Rather, Caleb was remembering that God had promised, that's where my people will live. See, he kept the target in focus while everybody else was looking the wrong direction. They were focusing on fear. And I think the lesson for us this morning is that we cannot focus both on fear and on God's promises. One will always drive the other out. And you can't have both of those. And I think for many of us in our lives and in our churches, we're so focused on what we're afraid of that we have let fear and maybe more importantly, uncertainty begin to drive God's promises out of our focus. Because that's really what the Israelites were struggling with, right? Everything God said would be there was there. The thing they were struggling with was the fact that there were some extra things there. There were some things they didn't know about. And I don't know about you guys, but for me, uncertainty is often what trips me up. Things I didn't know about that all of a sudden pop up. That's my biggest frustration. That oftentimes derails me the most. And what we see is that fear is taking control. Even standing at the entryway to the promised land. And the Israelites are beginning to allow this fear and this uncertainty to usurp the position of God in their minds and in their hearts. They're allowing fear to grip them. And what I see fear leading to is this idea of can't. We can't do it. I mentioned it earlier, it's impossible. Now, growing up, I'm sure many of your parents were a lot like mine. My mom always said, can't shouldn't be in your vocabulary. You may not always be the best at everything, but can't is a word we use in this house. And I say that, and it reminds me, and that comes to mind because as Christians, we so often deem things, just like the Israelites, as impossible. Well, we can't possibly do that. But here's the thing. For a Christian, the word impossible should not be in your vocabulary, because that's the true meaning of Philippians chapter 4. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. One person standing with God is always a majority and is always capable, period. And so we need to take and we need to remove the word impossible from our vocabulary as Christians. Because what I see is rarely a church or even people who are living and existing on the promises of God, but rather one who, they don't reflect this idea that you find in Matthew 16:18, where Jesus says, I'll build my church on this rock and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. See, we get this image with that where we're hunkered down and we're just surviving. Well, I don't know about you guys, but if you don't know a whole lot about tactical and structure, gates are not an offensive weapon. They're there for defense. Jesus isn't saying you're surviving. Jesus is saying you are advancing. You are moving forward in my will, in God's will for your life and for your church, and ultimately for the world, the will that I have that all people would come to know me. When you think about that, that doesn't describe a whole lot of churches, a whole lot of people, that Satan, that hell is afraid of them. And I think it's because we're so focused on things we're afraid of, on things we're uncertain about. And we begin to just substitute an existence, this facade of, maybe we're in control or we're living the good life. And I think it was a couple weeks ago, Pastor Brandon said, you know what the biggest enemy of great is? It's good. God doesn't want us to be good. God wants us to be great. And so we find ourselves just sort of existing and sort of frustrated. But on the surface, we're going to allow our pride to say, well, we have control. And that's where we find ourselves. And I think what that then takes us to is our second thing I begin to see the Israelites focus on, that they allow their fear to stem from a focus on the factors. Circumstances. Right? We said already, there were things they didn't know about. And they were worried about that. They were concerned about that. And we were talking about this message, and Pastor Brendan said, hey, can you briefly talk about the Nephilim? And the answer is no, because there's no way to do it briefly. But I'm going to sort of point to it and say, hey, this is why the Nephilim, I'm not going to explain who they are and all of that, but I want to hit why they're significant. Not just here, but everywhere you see Nephilim in the Bible. Now, Nephilim are huge people, big guys. They're very accomplished fighters. In fact, you can think about maybe David and Goliath, although not the same. Goliath was like 13 feet tall, somewhere in there. And it says in Amos chapter 2, verse 6, that the Nephilim were like cedar trees. Now, for Israelites, that's significant because cedar was one of the biggest trees that grew in the area. It's huge. And so we begin to see, and they begin to talk about these Nephilim and how they are there. And we notice that, again, Caleb never refutes that there are Nephilim there. He doesn't say that's not true. So we can assume safely that they are, in fact, there. In fact, if you read about the conquest in the book of Joshua, it talks about several Nephilim by name, one of which is King Og, and they will even provide you some measurements for how big he was. So you can, it's in cubits, so you'll have to go to Google and convert that for yourself. And it talks about Joshua slaying King Og. See, the important thing about Nephilim are every time they appear in the Bible, their primary purpose is for God to use a regular human being to defeat them. Again, because God is saying, nothing's impossible here. It may not be possible for you, but it is for me. And I think the other part of that with regard to the Nephilim, if you read the spies, how do they refer to themselves? We look like grasshoppers. Again, they're focused on their perspective of things. Well, what do we look like as opposed to them? You guys know Ryan, right, who plays guitar over here? To me, I look like a grasshopper to Ryan. Right? I mean, that's just, it is what it is. And, they're set in between the people of God and God's will. And I think there's a reason for that. Because again, as we've already said, there's no way a ragtag group of slaves has any chance. But that's important, because what we'll see is that when Israel defeats those types of enemies, there is no doubt about whose victory that really was. There is no doubt about the power of God. And so we all experience that. I think we all have things in our life, big things that are between us and the will of God. Whether it be addiction, whether it be sin, whether it be, maybe you don't even have that relationship with God. And I think those things are there because every time we are able to go through those and we are able to conquer those, there's no doubt to the people around us about who did that, about whose victory that was. Because for me, yes, that's impossible. But for God, nothing is impossible. It makes me think back to when I was very little. When I was little, I loved football. I loved it. I mean, I played football from the time I was 5 years old all the way up till I graduated high school, with a couple years off in my high school years because I wanted to devote to wrestling. I don't know how many of you are familiar with rec league football, like the little kids. But when I was in rec league football, we still hit. We had the helmet and the pads, you know what I'm talking about? And I'm 5 years old, right? And they don't have, the knee pads are like shin guards actually. And you can't turn your head because your helmet is stuck in your shoulder pads. That was me. Well, they have divisions in rec league. Somebody who's 5 doesn't end up going against like a 6th grader, because even in 6th grade where I was growing up, you could still play rec league sports. And so these names are terrible, by the way. They're awful. So the first league was Pee-wees. Then you had the Mighty Mites, and then the Midgets. Right? These are terrible names. Anyway, so Pee-wee was for 6 to 8-year-olds. Well, we had enough 5-year-olds that wanted to play that we made a pre-Pee-wee team. So we were small shrimps, I guess. So that's the team I played on, the pre-Pee-wee team. Well, nobody else that we played had a pre-Pee-wee team. So we had to play all the Pee-wee teams. So I don't know if you've ever seen the size difference between like a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old, but that can be a big difference. And in this process, I found out something about myself in football. I love to hit. Like, growing up, I didn't want to be the running back. I didn't want to be the quarterback. I wanted to hit people. I was like 2 foot tall, 33 pounds, and I was the fullback, and I played defensive line. If you don't know what a fullback is, that's the first running back. He runs through and hits the big guys, the first guy in the hole, so the other running back with the ball doesn't get tackled. That's what I love. Man, I loved it. And I would try to hit people hard enough I could keep going and get the next guy too. That's just what I like to do. The reason is, and I found out very quickly, playing against big guys, it's like getting hit by a Coke machine with legs. And so when I first started playing, I would brace like this. Anybody who's ever played football will tell you that's like the worst thing you can do, because it hurts a lot more. When you're like this and then they just run through you, that's no fun. And I quickly learned a valuable lesson that would benefit me all the way up through my playing career. When I hit that guy with everything I had, I didn't notice it near as much, and he sure felt it. And so what I began to learn was, it didn't matter how big the target was, if you could hit him in the right place hard enough, it didn't matter how small you were. And that served all the way up through my senior year. I wrestled 130 pounds, and I was tackling, our fullback now plays lineman for the Jacksonville Jaguars. I was hitting big guys. And so I figured out that with all the strength and all the power that I had, I could make them feel it. But with all the strength and all the power that God has, it doesn't matter how big the target is, they're not just going to feel it. They're going to get out of the way. Or you're going to go through it. One or the other. And I think so often we're so focused on circumstances that in our lives we're just doing this when God just wants you to go full steam ahead. And so we begin to look and see, and I'm not hating on the Israelites at all. I mean, from all perspective, they didn't have a shot. Again, their focus was on the circumstances, not on God's promises, not on God's will. See, they let their imagination run wild with what could be and what ifs. And I think oftentimes it's the what ifs that drown out the promises. We'd rather talk about and focus on, well, this might happen rather than what God says will happen. It's not so important about all the little speed bumps along the road when God is already telling you where the destination is. And so we talked in my last message about how quickly we can forget history. We forget that God is not only a God of miracles, but God is faithful. You're talking about a group of people who just recently walked across an ocean that God did that, and it was dry land. Millions of people walked across dry land where there was an ocean. Not like 30 years before they had time to build a wall and dam it up, like 30 seconds before. And yet they get so focused on the circumstances, they forget that God is in control of the circumstances. And I feel like many times in our lives, in our churches, in our families, we allow challenging circumstances to doom us. God didn't say getting there would be easy. He just said, this is my desire for the end result. And I think fear and circumstances, that they play off one another, right? As things get more difficult, we get more afraid. And as we get more afraid, we start to notice things that might go wrong. It's this cyclical effect that we find ourselves in. I'm not sure how many of you have any experience in like training a dog, like, beyond like sit, come, stay, that kind of thing. But there was a study done, and the whole goal of this was to get a dog to ignore a bowl of food or treats and go to their master every time. And what they quickly found out is something very interesting, that if they were able to get the dog to focus on the master, it didn't matter what noise or food, it didn't matter what was around it, it would go straight to the master every time. However, if the dog looked to the left or the right and saw treats, almost exclusively it would go to the treats. And I think there's a good lesson for us there. If our focus is on the master, it doesn't matter what's going on around us, we're able to stay true and continue in the direction he desires for us. However, if we are like the Israelites and we begin to focus on the things to the side, whether they be good or bad, that we begin to find ourselves derailed. And I mean, it's not comfortable for me to compare myself to a dog, but perhaps that's an apt comparison. And so what I find is that as we begin to focus on what we're afraid of, or focus on the circumstances around us, again, we go into this idea of maintenance mode. This idea that we're just going to be happy where we are. This idea that we're not going to pursue God's will for our lives. In fact, what we begin to do is we begin to reflect on our past. And we get nostalgia for the good old days. You guys know what I'm talking about? We begin to talk about how awesome things were back then. And what we do is we begin to romanticize that. Well, let me go ahead and warn you, it wasn't as awesome as you remember it, for sure. But we begin to look back, and where that danger comes in is we begin to say, well, we did things this way before, and it worked. So let's just try that again. I see that a lot in churches. Or this was working for our family or in my own life, so I'm going to do that. And what we begin to do is we begin to not look into the past. We begin to live in the past. And we begin to get stuck in the past. Now, I want to be very clear. I think that God teaches us lots of lessons from our past, but I also know that God does not work in the past. God is interested in today and forward. And so many of us are making a life sentence out of what God intends to be a life lesson. We're keeping ourselves trapped in mistakes of our past or in, just whatever is back here rather than learning from it and doing it different the next time. And so we get so stuck in that and we think, well, things were so awesome. And we find that we allow our fear and our circumstances to dictate us back into a past. And now for Christians, for us, that's very alarming because I don't know about you, but I don't want to go back living into a past that's dictated by sin. A past that's run by addictions. A past where I have this illusion of control, but it's really a train wreck waiting to happen. See, here's the thing about things being in your way and just circumstances, and there'll always be circumstances there. But no matter where you are, there's always a circumstance between you and the will of God. And sometimes that's your past. For those of us who have never experienced a relationship with Jesus Christ, that thing between you and God is yourself. It is sin. You were born as a sinner. But here's the good news. That's an illusion. There's nothing really there because Jesus Christ already died on the cross to take care of that sin. All you have to do is acknowledge that you are a sinner and accept that He died the death that you should have died because He lived a life you couldn't live. That's how we take that first step into the promised land, into God's will for your life. That's God's will for everybody's life. And then as you move forward, again, you're going to experience different challenges. And we don't really want to deal with those challenges, right? Because we're standing there and what we want is God to give us a pay raise rather than to say, hey, God, make me a better steward with what you're already giving me. Because one's easy, one's our promised land, the other is God's. Or, God, I need a new job. I need a promotion. Rather than, God, make me an example and a witness for you right where you've planted me. Because normally, the way God works, and we've talked about this some too, is that He works on your character before He promotes you to a different position. Or, God, let me give you control of these parts of my life, but I'm going to keep control of these parts of my life. See, the thing about God's promised land is it's great, but it's often difficult for us to enter because our pride gets in the way. And so that's why I say sometimes, and for many of us, that the most difficult thing that we're going to have to face and have to get through may not be fears, it may not be circumstances, it may be ourselves. Because I often find that I'm the hardest person to get out of my own way. Just being honest. So, as we begin to look, we get there and we think, that's why we think maybe the past is not so bad. This is so hard. Maybe the past isn't so bad. Now, it's been about 10 years or so, but there was a book written by a couple of teenagers, and it was a book for students to use in student ministry, and it was called Do Hard Things. I mean, you can't get a more blunt title than that. And I used it with my first youth group, and what it was, and I think it's appropriate not just for students, but for everybody, and it was talking about, hey, if you're not challenged right where you're at, if your circumstances aren't a little uncomfortable, if you're not a little bit afraid, you're not living up to your God-given potential. They said, and so I'm saying this morning, if you're comfortable, you have probably taken a right turn and you're going off into the wilderness. And that's where we begin to look and we begin to see we don't want to do difficult things. So let's go back to the past where we had an illusion of comfortable. Being addicted to that wasn't so bad. Ignorance is bliss. I think it's a Lecrae song. He says, ignorance is bliss, but then they never knew this. Ignorance is not bliss once you know the gospel. And so we see that ultimately we are just like the Israelites. What do they say at the end of the passage? Let's get a new leader and go back to Egypt. Okay, let me break that down for you. They decided that slavery was a better option than facing their own fears. And that sounds stupid to us, but we do it each day in our own life. We have decided that this sin is better. The sin that we know is better than a freedom in God we don't know all the details about. That's crazy. Just to throw a July 4th plug in there that I didn't do first service. What if we had decided that at least the tax that we knew was better than the uncertainty of the freedom that we didn't? So we end up, and reality is we find ourselves living in past comforts and past vices that really don't satisfy because we found the one thing that does satisfy. And then somewhere in all of that we say, well, where is God? Why can't I find God? Because you chose to go to the wilderness. And so we forget the faithfulness and the power of God. And one thing I have learned in my life and in my time in ministry, you will always, always, always find a leader who's willing to take you backwards. And a lot of times it's ourselves. I take my own life in the wrong direction. And subsequently, I take my family in the wrong direction. And because of the position I am here, I began to attempt to lead in the wrong direction here. That's true for all of us. In our own lives, in our own families, and in this church. Because what we begin to lose is sight of God's vision. And when you lose sight of vision, nothing else makes a difference. We talk about it a lot in leadership development. The how and the what are important, but if they're not connected to the why, it doesn't make any difference. And so what we see is that a divided group doesn't accomplish anything. I don't know how many of you know the name Warren Wiersbe, but he's a noted author from I was going to say a long time ago. Let's not say a long time ago. He's a historically noted author, and he said, you do not move ahead by constantly looking in the rearview mirror. The past is a rudder to guide you, not an anchor to drag you. We must learn from the past, but we must learn not to live in the past. I think many of us have begun to live in the past. I know many churches live in the past. Well, this worked in the 80s, so surely it'll work now. And we do the same thing in our lives. We focus so much on how things used to be, we forget that the present, or don't realize the present, has left us behind. See, ultimately, every time you stand at the promised land, God's will, every minute of every day, and you make a decision, you are defining your legacy. See, we talk about legacy and we think about, it's the past, but here's the thing about legacy. You redefine it every minute of every day. Is your life going to be a legacy of one that pursues after God's will in your life, regardless of challenges and circumstances and fears, or is it going to be one that's known for heading back into the wilderness? I mean, think about it. How do we talk about that generation of Israelites saved for Caleb and Joshua? What do we say? Don't be like them. Here's an example of what not to do. And each of us has that opportunity. each and every day to again, decide. I love, this is why Caleb is also one of my favorite characters in the Bible. If you continue to read and you go and you read the conquest of the Promised Land, and Israel is victorious and they win, and they're at the point where they are dividing up the land for the 12 tribes. Okay, who's going to live where? What's the boundary the border is going to be like, so to speak? Joshua gives Caleb the pick. The last of that generation, Caleb has been a successful leader alongside Joshua. Caleb was faithful when it was difficult. Think about it. They were faithful even though they also spent 40 years in the desert. Caleb's 85 years old. If anything, Caleb's legacy is set. He could have said, I want this. Send me down here by the edge of the ocean. I want the seaside resort. He could have been a lot like Lot in that sense. Chosen the easy ground, the good ground. But instead, Caleb looks at Joshua, surveys the land, and picks the biggest mountain. Said, that's where my people will live. Because God has been moving obstacles from the day I can remember, and he's going to continue moving obstacles until the day I die. It's constantly a decision to pursue God's will or to take the easy choice that leads back into slavery. And so we have to be willing or be aware of where we find our focus. Are we focusing on what we're afraid of? Are we focusing on the circumstances around us? Are we so afraid of those things that we're romanticizing the past? Are we going to choose the desert over the promised land simply because the road to the promised land is difficult? I think ultimately what we need to remember is that each of us are an example of why nothing is impossible with God. Because the Bible is very clear, as a sinner, there is nothing that I can do to fix that. It's impossible. And yet God does that every day. He takes someone from eternal death into eternal life. And he says, hey, this is the person I want you to be. But to get there, there's going to be a lot of bumps along the road. It's going to be difficult. I mean, ultimately, it boils down to trust. All right, what did the Israelites say when they said, we can't do it? They said, God, we don't trust what you said. And each of us, every day, we stand there and say, God, we don't trust you. We don't trust where you told us in the New Testament that he who started a work within you will continue it until completion. It's not my power that gets me there, it's God's power. What do I base that on? God's word. Because in my experience, in my research, whatever God says will happen, will happen. I don't know about you guys, but I like a sure thing. And that's as close to a sure thing as you're ever going to find. So really, what we have to do is we have to decide at a personal level and at a corporate level, do we trust God? I know that's putting it blunt, and I know that's uncomfortable, but maybe it's time we get blunt and uncomfortable. Because God has said, these are the things that are going to happen. Are we now willing to walk in those things? Or do we prefer the illusion of control? Do we prefer our own brand of slavery? Ultimately, God has a vision in your own life and a vision for this church. And each of us daily making those decisions is moving that forward or beginning to hamper that. And I, for one, don't want to be counted with a generation that's best contribution was don't be that way. Do it different. Ultimately, my plea this morning is that if you are standing there and you have never experienced a relationship with God, that you would realize this morning, A, that you need that. That's essential. It's the only true way to live and experience life. And whatever you believe is between you and God and preventing that Jesus Christ took that away. That you just have to accept Him as Savior and Lord. And for those of us who have already done that, who, we are standing there and we're saying, well, I'm not experiencing the promised land, or I'm not, God's will for me is here and I'm struggling with this. It's my prayer that you remember that whatever addictions you're struggling with, whatever sins you have chosen to return to, that the God who defeated them originally is still the same God. That those of us that we are afraid, not that all fear would disappear, but that we would learn to step forward in courage. And not our own courage, but courage based on the power of God. That those of us who are focused on circumstances, that we would begin to remember that God is in control of those circumstances. That the same God that was sleeping during the storm and stood up and said, "Peace, be still," is still the same God. Most of all, it's my hope this morning that we would walk away with a renewed focus, not on anything, but on the Master and His will in our lives. Let's pray.